The day she turned on me didn't come with warning. It came with applause. It was the morning of the client gala, a celebration of the firm's record-breaking quarter. Marissa had orchestrated every inch of it. From the imported champagne to the smug press releases, the board called her a visionary. The clients adored her polish. And me? I stood behind her, smiling for photos I wanted to burn. Underneath the glittering lights, she looked untouchable. But she wasn't. The numbers she flaunted were built on lies I'd already preserved in encrypted folders, dated, signed, and ready to surface. All I needed was time. One more week to finalize everything before I quietly handed it all to the right agency. But Marissa didn't give me a week. The betrayal began with a whisper. Someone had told HR that I was misusing company data. They called me into a small, sterile conference room. White walls, no windows, a digital recorder blinking on the table. 2 compliance officers sat across from me, their eyes polite but sharp. They asked if I had exported client files, accessed restricted servers, or altered financial reports. My stomach dropped. The questions weren't random. They were surgical, precise. Someone had fed them exact phrasing from my activity logs. Someone like her. I played dumb, pretending to be confused. They told me it was a routine check, but I could see the file with my name already open. Marissa had beaten me to the punch. She'd sensed the danger and moved first. When I returned to my desk, my access was suspended. My screen flashed red. Authorization denied. Marissa appeared minutes later, pretending to be surprised. "Oh no," she said, her tone dripping with fake concern. "It's just doing a system-wide security check. I'm sure it's nothing." But I saw the smirk she tried to hide. That evening, I found her in the executive lounge, laughing with a few partners. She didn't even acknowledge me, just lifted her glass and toasted to loyalty and discretion. I stood there, feeling the walls close in, the humiliation tightening around my throat. That night, my inbox filled with warnings, internal audits, flagged credentials, security notifications. It was clear she'd framed me. She had copied her own illegal files into my access logs, rerouted them through my account, and sent an anonymous tip to compliance. The evidence was damning, and all of it pointed to me. I stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop, rage simmering under my skin. The woman I'd covered for, protected, worked under for years, had turned me into her scapegoat. I thought I was 2 steps ahead, but she'd weaponized the very system I thought I controlled. And then came the final insult. The next morning, Marissa called me into her office. Her tone was calm, almost gentle. "I've been reviewing your performance," she said. "You've been distracted lately, unfocused." She pretended to sigh, then looked up with faux sympathy. "I want to help you, but the firm can't tolerate carelessness. So here's what we'll do. You resign quietly, I'll make sure it doesn't reach your record, and we both move on." I stared at her. "You're serious?" She smiled. "Sweetheart, this is mercy." Mercy. The word sliced through me. I wanted to scream, to throw the truth in her face, but I didn't. Because in that moment, something colder replaced the anger. She thought she'd ended me. But she'd just handed me the last piece I needed. Proof of retaliation and motive. I walked out of her office that day with a polite nod and an empty box in my hands. The entire floor watched as I packed my things. The perfect image of a woman defeated. Marissa lingered in her glass office, pretending to make calls, glancing out occasionally with that smug satisfaction of a victor. But what she didn't know was that I had already backed up everything to a private drive outside the firm's network. Every encrypted file, every false report, every transfer she had ever touched, and most importantly, the metadata that proved her account had accessed restricted servers using my credentials. She thought she'd buried me, but she'd just set the stage for her own destruction. I left that office quietly. No scene, no fight, no tears, just a calm, steady silence that only I understood. Because sometimes, the best revenge doesn't come from shouting the truth. It comes from letting them dig their own grave, while you hand the shovel to the feds. When I left with the empty box, I didn't go home to crumble. I went to work on a plan that would make every lie she'd told collapse under its own weight. The first rule was simple. Don't act like the person they expect. Marissa wanted drama. Tears, public breakdowns, a viral meltdown she could turn into unprofessional behavior. So I kept breathing, kept my voice low, and built a map. My apartment became a second office. I set up clean machines that never touched the firm's network, encrypted drives labeled with ordinary names so they wouldn't stand out. I recaptured every illicit transfer, every off-hours login, every forwarded memo that had ever come through her inbox. I pulled audit trails, cross-referenced timestamps, and archived the metadata that no PR team could rewrite. If she had forged signatures, I wanted the exact sequence that showed how, when, and from which terminal. But evidence alone isn't drama. Evidence is a cold thing. Justice needs context. So I created the story that would carry the evidence. A timeline that would read like a narrative, short and undeniable. Who benefited? How the money moved? Who lied in board meetings? And which clients were left exposed? I added screenshots, notarized copies of documents where possible, and notes about the shell companies that appeared like ghosts on paper. Next, I needed allies who wouldn't be bought or mesmerized by her charm. I reached out quietly, former colleagues who had left under strange circumstances, a compliance officer I'd once helped when they were drowning in paperwork, an ex-auditor who owed me an old favor. No grand speeches, just plain facts and a request. Look at this. Tell me if this is abnormal. I let the data speak, and it did. People with no stake in the scandal nodded, scratched their heads, and admitted there was something rotten. Timing was the final, delicate piece. If I sent everything to the wrong inbox, it would die under bureaucracy or be swept under executive carpet. If I moved too soon, Marissa would gaslight her way out, feeding denials into the press. So I created a trigger, a chain reaction that would be impossible to ignore. I packaged the core evidence and sequestered copies in 3 places: a trusted whistleblower portal at a regulatory agency, an encrypted drop sent to a journalist who covered corporate crime, and a sealed legal brief with a pro bono lawyer I'd found through those former colleagues. Each package contained identical timestamps and a clear statement. Investigate these transactions. We believe insider trading and client fraud took place. Contact the attached witness if you need clarification. No dramatics, no vengeance language, just the facts, lined up like soldiers. The coffee line, my signature move, was theater more than poison. I scheduled a meeting where Marissa would be confident, where she'd feel superior. I forwarded her a calendar invite with a subject she'd never refuse: quarterly client review, prepare deck. She would arrive thinking she was untouchable. Instead, she walked into the first domino. On the morning of the meeting, while she polished her cufflinks, regulators began to open the sealed portal I'd used. The journalist I'd contacted flagged the same anomalies in public filings and pinged a source at the agency. The lawyer filed a preliminary request to preserve evidence. It wasn't a hack or a leak from my former access. It was a coordinated legal unspooling of truth. The firm's systems lit up with alerts, and compliance, now with outside eyes, could no longer ignore what had been dressed as routine. Most importantly, I stayed invisible. I never called a press conference. I didn't send a single anonymous tip to gossip sites. I let the mechanisms we'd built do the work: law, procedure, and plain documented records. And as the first officials drafted their questions, I watched from a distance, sipping coffee in a diner 2 blocks away, feeling more awake than I had in years. Because revenge isn't about ruin for the joy of it. It's about restoring balance. It's about making sure the people who treat other people like tools understand that tools can be turned into evidence. When the first investigator walked into the glass tower, I knew the stage was set. Marissa would still perform. She's a master of show. But this time, the audience had subpoenas and auditors in their seats. Would she fold under scrutiny? Would she try to silence witnesses? Or would her arrogance lead her to make the one mistake that would finish her? The board meeting started as planned. The doors closed. The slides lit up. Outside, the legal wheels had already begun to turn. Part 6 was waiting for the lights to drop. They say revenge is best served cold, but mine came with cream, sugar, and a federal case file. The morning it all began, the office smelled like burnt espresso and fear. It was one of those glass and steel towers where everyone pretended to smile, even when they were dying inside. I had mastered that smile too. Polite, efficient, invisible. Because in that world, being noticed wasn't always a compliment. It was a warning. She noticed me. Every single day, Marissa Vaughn, Vice President of Strategic Investments, polished to perfection, a designer suit wrapped around ambition sharper than a blade. To her, people weren't colleagues. They were tools, replaceable, forgettable. And for 2 years, I was her favorite one. She didn't see me as an analyst. She saw me as the girl who fetched her lattes, booked her flights, and cleaned up her small mistakes before they turned into headlines. I was the silent fixer, the one she could insult and ignore in the same breath. But she made one mistake. She thought silence meant weakness. I still remember the morning she snapped her fingers at me across the open floor. Coffee, black, 2 sugars, and don't burn it this time. The entire floor froze. I felt every pair of eyes on me. My cheeks burned, my pulse hammered, but I said nothing. I turned, walked to the kitchen, and smiled. Because that was the day I stopped being her shadow. That was the day I decided to let her bury herself. The funny thing about corporate offices is, the real battles never happen in boardrooms. They happen quietly, in shared drives, in email trails, in tiny overlooked details. And Marissa was messy, reckless. She thought no one would notice her adjustments to transaction logs, her encrypted folders labeled as client models. But I noticed, for months. I'd been archiving her corrections, every altered record, every suspicious login. I didn't know exactly what I'd find, until one night, when a misplaced decimal led me down a rabbit hole that reeked of insider trading. She wasn't just manipulating numbers. She was manipulating lives, and while she ordered another cup of coffee, I was building a file so airtight it could choke her career in silence. Still, I played my part perfectly, the obedient assistant, the quiet analyst with potential, the one she could humiliate in meetings and still trust with her passwords. I smiled, nodded, and fetched her caffeine while my private drive filled with evidence. But here's the twist. I wasn't doing it out of spite. Not yet. I was waiting for the exact moment she'd take it too far, when her arrogance would hand me the final piece. And that moment came sooner than I thought. It was a Thursday morning when she called me into her office. The blinds were half drawn, sunlight slicing across the desk like a spotlight on her manicured hands. "I need you to sign off on these reconciliation reports," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness. "Just a formality. You know how compliance gets." I looked down. My name was already typed under hers. My signature box, blank, her numbers, falsified. That was the moment I stopped being afraid. I looked her straight in the eye, and for the first time she saw it. The quiet fury she had built with every insult, every condescending order. She smirked, thinking I'd fold like always. But she had no idea that the next cup of coffee she asked for would mark the beginning of her end. Because when Marissa asked for coffee, I gave her a federal breach. The day after that forged signature incident, the office felt heavier. Like the air itself knew something had shifted. Marissa's voice echoed across the trading floor, commanding, polished, untouchable, and I played my role like a pro, pretending her words still had power over me. But inside, a quiet storm had begun. I'd spent 2 years analyzing numbers, finding patterns where others saw noise. Now I was analyzing her. Every word, every login, every urgent after-hours request, all logged, all documented. It started as a small folder hidden deep in my encrypted drive. I named it V Project. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was strategy. Marissa's arrogance made my job easier. She left digital footprints like perfume, everywhere she went. Her emails were full of contradictions, and her approvals on client transactions didn't align with the timestamps in our risk system. She was moving money where it shouldn't go, but through shells so complex that only someone like me could trace them. And I traced every single one. Still, I had to be careful. The firm was a fortress of glass and gossip. One wrong move and she'd destroy me before I could even make my case. She had influence. Board members who owed her favors. senior partners who adored her charm. I was a name in the middle of a spreadsheet, invisible until I wasn't. So I played invisible perfectly. When she called me for another coffee run, I smiled, grabbed her usual order, and placed it on her desk like nothing was wrong. I listened while she complained about clients, while she mocked the compliance officer, while she bragged about a quiet bonus that no one knew about. I nodded and sipped my own cup, the one that kept me awake through midnight audits of her deceit. At home, my apartment became a war room. Screens glowing in the dark, financial statements scattered across my floor, encrypted backups uploading to cloud storage I'd set up under anonymous credentials. I wasn't just gathering proof. I was preparing a masterpiece. Every file had a timeline, every screenshot a timestamp, every message cross-referenced to something undeniable. But to win against someone like Marissa, you don't just need evidence. You need theater. She was a woman who lived for appearances, who fed on control, so I had to let her feel safe, to believe she still had me under her heel. I started sending her progress reports, letting her think I was fixing her mistakes again. She praised me for being efficient. She even told a director I was her most loyal junior. That was my green light. The deeper she trusted me, the more reckless she became. She began forwarding me internal memos marked confidential, asking me to adjust them for presentation. Each one contained pieces of her scheme, insider tips, disguised as market forecasts. Every edit she requested was another thread in the web she didn't realize I was tightening around her. By the end of that month, I had enough to bury her career 10 times over. But I didn't want her just fired. I wanted her unmasked, because this wasn't just about humiliation anymore. It was about justice. Quiet, calculated, irreversible justice. And soon, all it would take was one perfectly timed email. And one ordinary cup of coffee. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning, right before the quarterly board review. Marissa was in her element, strutting across the glass hallway, heels like gunshots, that smug smile plastered on her face. She loved these meetings. They were her stage, her audience, her validation. I followed behind, a silent shadow clutching her presentation deck, the one I had prepared, line by line. But what she didn't know was that buried deep in her glossy charts were the first seeds of her own undoing. One misplaced slide, one harmless-looking dataset, and one compliance metric that no one ever paid attention to, except me. It wasn't enough to expose her yet, but it was enough to make her sweat. During the presentation, she spoke about ethical growth, transparency, and client trust, words that tasted like poison coming from her mouth. I sat there watching, expression calm, heartbeat steady. She gestured toward my work as if it were her masterpiece, her numbers, her brilliance. I let her have it, because the more she performed, the higher she climbed, and the harder she'd fall. But something unexpected happened. After the meeting, she called me into her office, poured herself a coffee, and for the first time, smiled without venom. "You're sharp," she said. "I see potential in you." I almost laughed. She wasn't praising me. She was recruiting me. She wanted a partner in crime, someone she could control but still use. "If you keep this up," she said, leaning back in her chair, "I could take you places. Places like federal prison, maybe." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because I realized how far she was willing to go. She wasn't just manipulating numbers anymore. She was building an empire out of deceit, one shell company at a time. And now, she wanted me to be part of it. The next few weeks blurred into an act of careful performance. I played the eager protege, nodding through her whispered tips, pretending to admire her genius while quietly recording everything. Every illegal trade she hinted at, every name she mentioned, every transaction she corrected after hours, all neatly documented. But the tension grew. She began testing me, asking questions she never used to ask. "You've been quiet lately," she'd say. "You're not hiding anything from me, are you?" My pulse would spike, but my face stayed calm. "Just focused," I'd reply. "Like you taught me." She'd smile. But I could see it, that flicker of doubt in her eyes. She was suspicious. Then came the morning that changed everything. She stormed into my cubicle, eyes sharp. "Someone's been accessing restricted folders," she hissed. "Compliance flagged an unusual login pattern last night. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" My stomach turned to ice. She was close. Dangerously close. I met her gaze and lied through my teeth. "No idea, ma'am. Maybe IT should check the shared servers again." For a moment, she just stared. Then she smiled, slow, poisonous. "Of course. I should have known you're too smart to get sloppy." She walked away, heels echoing down the hall. But in that silence, I knew something had shifted again. The hunter had felt the trap closing, and now the real game was about to begin. The morning the investigators arrived, the building looked the same. Tall, quiet, immaculate. But the air inside carried something new. A tension, sharp and metallic, that made even the interns whisper slower. No one knew yet, but the storm had already crossed the threshold. Marissa walked in late, holding her phone like a weapon, heels echoing through the marble lobby. She smiled at everyone, the kind of smile that commands obedience. She had no idea that just one floor above, 2 agents from the Federal Financial Crimes Division were already setting up in the conference room. I watched from across the street through the cafe window, the same cafe where I used to pick up her overpriced cappuccinos, my hands wrapped around a mug, not shaking, steady. The aroma of burnt espresso felt poetic somehow. At exactly 9:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from one of my old allies in compliance. "They're here, starting interviews," it began quietly. They didn't announce an investigation. They conducted routine data validation. But as the morning dragged on, whispers spread. File reviews, unexpected audits, account freezes. Marissa noticed. Her assistant told her that 2 men in suits had requested access to her authorization history. She laughed it off, saying she had nothing to hide. Then they asked to speak to her, privately. Inside that glass conference room, her composure began to crack. They laid out the timeline I'd built, identical dates, mirrored transactions, patterns too exact to dismiss as coincidence. One of the agents slid a folder toward her, saying calmly, "We'd like to understand these discrepancies." She flipped through the papers, eyes scanning the highlighted rows. I knew that look, that split-second flicker between arrogance and panic. She tried to regain control, spinning stories about delegation errors and junior oversight. But every defense she gave only led them closer to the truth, because the data didn't just point to her. It spoke in her voice, her logins, her timestamps, her authorization tokens, her emails. She had made me her scapegoat. But in doing so, she'd connected her name to every transaction she tried to hide. By noon, her laughter had vanished. She stormed out of the conference room, face pale, hair slightly undone. The office watched as she paced the hallway, phone pressed to her ear. She was calling legal, calling the CEO, calling anyone who could still believe her version of events, but no one was answering now. The first public sign came that afternoon, an emergency email from the executive office. All staff are to cooperate fully with the ongoing compliance review. Please refrain from discussing internal matters externally. That's when the whispers became a flood. People speculated, exchanged looks, and avoided her eyes. Power was shifting in real time. She must have sensed it too. At 4 p.m., she marched into the boardroom for an emergency meeting she'd called herself. I wasn't there, but later I saw the transcript. Her desperate attempt to reassert control, claiming it was a misunderstanding and a coordinated attempt to discredit her. The CEO's reply was cold, procedural. "Marissa, federal regulators are now involved. This is beyond internal review." Silence. Then the sound of a badge sliding across the table. She was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, her ID deactivated before she even left the room. She walked out through the same glass doors she once owned, face blank, hands trembling slightly around her phone. The world she'd ruled was now watching her fall. From my cafe window, I saw her car pull up. She sat inside for a long minute, staring at nothing. I wondered what she was thinking. About the assistant she mocked, the reports she forged, the people she ruined for her ambition. I didn't feel joy. Not exactly. It was quieter than that. More final, justice doesn't roar. It exhales. And as I took one last sip of my coffee, the same kind she once demanded every morning, I whispered under my breath, "You asked for coffee, Marissa, and I gave you a federal breach." The city lights flickered on outside. Inside that tower, auditors stayed late, sealing documents, locking accounts, downloading evidence. The sound of her empire collapsing was faint but unmistakable, the quiet crumble of arrogance meeting consequence. It was over, or so I thought. Because the next morning, my phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. "We'd like to meet." "In person. Regarding the files you sent." My pulse quickened. The storm wasn't done, not yet. The meeting took place in a quiet government office 2 blocks from the firm. No badges, no dramatics. Just 2 agents, a recorder, and a single folder marked confidential. They weren't there to interrogate me. They were there to close the loop. The evidence had spoken for itself. The transactions, the fake accounts, the falsified reconciliations. The agency had connected the dots to multiple insider trades over 2 fiscal years, millions in manipulated profits, dozens of compromised investors. Marissa's empire had been built on deceit, and it had finally collapsed under its own numbers. I listened as they outlined the outcome. The firm's board had issued a statement of cooperation. Her assets were frozen, and federal charges were pending. Several of her loyal colleagues were also under review for aiding her cover-ups. One of the agents paused, looking at me over his glasses. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "You kept your records clean. You helped a lot of people by coming forward. But I didn't feel like a hero. I just nodded, hands clasped in my lap. Because the truth is, revenge doesn't always feel like victory. It feels like silence, like the sound of something ending that should have ended long ago." Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Cars honked, people hurried, emails were sent, and somewhere inside that tower, her empty office still smelled faintly of coffee and expensive perfume. I walked past the building one last time. Through the glass, I saw my old desk, now cleared, replaced by someone new. I didn't feel regret, just closure. I had lost a job, but I'd reclaimed something bigger. My dignity, my peace, my power. And as I stood there watching the reflection of the skyline shimmer against the glass, I whispered to myself, "Let her world rebuild without lies this time." Then I turned away, finally free from the weight of her shadow. The story was over. But the lesson, that power built on fear always collapses, would never fade. When it was all over, the silence of the office felt strange. The whispers stopped. The laughter turned to cautious hellos, and those who once dismissed me now avoided eye contact. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply walked past the corner where she used to sit. Her empty desk now a reminder that arrogance can disguise itself as charm, until truth strips it bare. That day, I realized something deeper. Revenge isn't always about payback. Sometimes it's about reclaiming the dignity they tried to erase, piece by piece. I never needed to destroy her. I just let her lies collapse under the weight of their own corruption. And as I stepped into my new office, higher up, with my badge cleared by federal agents and my name restored, I smiled to myself, not out of pride but peace. This is revenge untold, where power meets its reckoning, and silence becomes the loudest justice.